First of all, welcome to the event. This is day 2 of the Mindful of AI workshop. My name is Shauna Concannon, and I will just give you a slide so we know we are. So for those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday, this is day 2, and the subject of the workshop is really language, technology and mental health. And in particular, we've been discussing a range of topics that help us think through some of the ways in which AI is increasingly being used in healthcare, and particularly mental health care contexts. And this is really a forum to explore some of the ethical and societal implications around that as we think about designing in this space. The event is organised by the Giving Voice to Digital Tool Democracies team, who are based at the University of Cambridge. And we're an interdisciplinary team. I'll just move this down. We're an interdisciplinary team of researchers who combine expertise in linguistics, computer science, and engineering. And the work that we do in this project is really trying to bring those interdisciplinary perspectives to bear on societal implications of particular technologies, and in specifically technologies that involve language. So for this particular workshop, we wanted to bring together an audience from academia and beyond, with expertise and knowledge in different areas. Today's first session is focusing on from understanding to automating therapeutic dialogues. And the focus is very much on dialogue and communication. And our two speakers will both be talking about conversation design and mental health communication, but from different perspectives. So one is working on human-machine communication and specifically designing chatbots for mental health and wellbeing support. And the other is involved in the analysis of patient-clinician, so human-human interaction, and looking at how clinical communication can impact and clinical outcomes. So these should both provide us with ample food for thought as we start thinking about the role of conversational AI in mental health contexts. As the capacity and capabilities of language technologies have improved, there has been an increased interest in how they can be utilised in healthcare settings. And in particular, there is a lot of research at the moment exploring how chatbots and conversational agents can either be integrated into existing workflows or possibly serve as standalone support tools. And as dialogue systems have become more sophisticated and widely used, with many people now owning smart speakers or using virtual personal assistants, conversational interfaces being more commonplace, I guess the feasibility of using these systems in healthcare settings becomes more viable, at least from a technological standpoint. However, as well as the technological challenges of developing competent conversational agents, there are also a number of other factors that require consideration. And you know, this poses a number of concerns and quite serious ethical considerations that researchers are simultaneously grappling with. And it's an area that really does benefit from having these diverse and distinct perspectives coming together to work on these problems collectively. And yeah, so the aim of this session really is to reflect on some of these issues and think about how systems can be developed in a way that they are safe, they are responsible, but also thinking about how conversation itself should be designed. So as humans, we're able to infer meaning. We can, things that have been conveyed implicitly, we're able to make sense of that and integrate that into how we choose to conduct ourselves, or what conversational resources we draw on and use, and how we talk to people, particularly in situations where there are safety critical contexts. How do we think about translating that to human, these very human skills into contexts where it is now potentially automated systems fulfilling some of these roles. And as Eileen Bendig touched on yesterday in her talk, while there is some evidence to suggest the potential promise of using chatbots in therapeutic context, there's currently insufficient data to draw conclusions on their effectiveness. So there are a number of open questions, particularly around how to evaluate these systems and how to really ask questions to get at understanding how they are working and what effects they are having. So rather than answering any of these questions myself, I will hand over to our speakers. But first, a few notes on housekeeping. Please feel free to ask questions through the chat function. We will be collating these and putting these to the speakers at the end of the talk and have time for discussion afterwards. We've scheduled plenty of time so that we can have some good discussion. And also I wanted to note that obviously the topic of this talk is mental health, and the talks may cover topics that some people may find distressing. Of course, if at any point you need to leave, please do. There will be the option to re-enter, etc. But do whatever you need to do. But there will be discussion relating to suicide in this topic, and I also ask the speakers to give good warning when they are talking about topics that may be difficult or distressing. There are also information sources about additional forms of support in the conference note booklet. Okay, so now I will introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is Raymond Bond. Raymond is a reader in data analytics at the University of Ulster, and he works on healthcare data science and the design of digital health interventions. His work includes both large-scale data analysis projects, such as examining the patterns of caller behaviours in mental health helpline dialogues, but also more human-centred design work that examines how particular user groups engage with and respond to various technologies. He's currently coordinating the ChatPal project funded by the EU NPA fund, which has recently released a co-designed chatbot to support the mental well-being of people in rural areas. And in today's talk, he'll be sharing some of the insights gathered during this process and discussing what responsible design in this space entails. Okay, over to you, Raymond, if you're happy to.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great, fantastic. Thanks very much, Shauna, for a lovely introduction. This presentation will mainly be about the ChatPal project. It's a 3-year project and it's just 12 months into the project. The main point in the presentation, if I waffle too much, the main point I want to get across is that a mental health chatbot should consider the needs of people. But not only that, we need to go beyond the user and look at what kind of chatbots professionals will endorse and what kind of chatbots AI can deliver well. So before I talk more about that project, at Ulster we have a team of researchers that do a number of projects in AI and mental health sciences, including the design and development of different digital mental health interventions, including apps and chatbots. We've also done quite a bit of machine learning with helpline call data for the Samaritans and Lifeline, where we have identified caller types, 5 different archetypes of callers. We're doing quite a bit of process mining right now and data analysis of electronic patient record systems for different mental health services, including psychological therapies, where we're looking at the kind of pathways, the different pathways that patients can take throughout that service, looking at their initial starting points to their outcomes. We're also a member of the Meniere project, where we're looking at speech analysis and machine learning to try and automatically classify people who maybe are having mental health problems and people who are maybe not having mental health problems, basically through a smart speaker interaction. So just some general statistics, which I'm sure you're all aware of. I had seen these statistics presented recently by Orca. And what struck me is that whilst most health apps are indeed mental health apps, only 29% of those mental health apps meet the ORCA quality benchmark. Now, ORCA assess the quality and validate the quality of health apps regarding their clinical assurance and their user experience and security and so on. And they're being used by the NHS and other organizations. But the fact that only 29% of mental health apps would meet that quality benchmark is somewhat alarming. So maybe chatbots can actually progress the quality of mental health apps. Also, like other apps and many apps, mental health apps have pretty poor user retention. So whilst you might have a lot of people downloading that app, you can lose 95% of users after just a few days. And we don't really know why that is. It could be because of app fatigue. People just try apps out and delete them. They don't find them engaging or worthwhile to use over a long period of time. So maybe chatbots can improve on the user retention of mental health apps, because a chatbot can provide lots of different dialogues and variability in its content over a longer period of time. So are chatbots a novel intervention? Well, they're novel in the sense that they provide a natural way for people to interact with the computer. So they use chat or voice, similar to how we talk to humans. So it is very different than a graphical user interface. Graphical user interfaces can often be very cumbersome and difficult to use, but having a chat conversation over a computer device is maybe more natural and more user-friendly. Of course, because a chatbot is simulating a human communication, a human type communication, users may engage with the chatbot sooner and even open up sooner to a computer, because the computer doesn't judge in comparison to what people might perceive of traditional services, or going to traditional services, or being seen to be going to traditional services. So I think chatbots are novel, and they're very different than a normal app. Obviously, as already mentioned by Shauna, there's a need for more evidence for the efficacy of mental health chatbots. So there's a number of review papers, and I haven't read them all, but one of the landmark studies had been this randomized controlled trial of Woebot. Woebot is a mental health chatbot developed at Stanford. And this paper does indeed show that Woebot can reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression. However, the RCT itself was only over a 2-week period, and we do need a lot more studies like this to get consilience and to have a lot of studies that are reproducible and somewhat agreeable. I can't help but be interested in the ethical issues and the challenges around chatbots, simply because a chatbot does imitate a human-to-human conversation. And because of that, people anthropomorphize or may anthropomorphize a chatbot and treat it as if it was a human, but it actually isn't a person. And because it isn't a person and it is a computer, it doesn't have true emotions or empathy. So a chatbot could tell you that it cares about you, but in actual fact, it can't. Now, the designer behind the chatbot might indeed care about people and about helping, but indeed the chatbot itself can't actually have true emotions. Also, I think people could overtrust the recommendations and advice that a chatbot gives. So normally we search Google and we find information that we want to read regarding healthcare advice and so on. But when you search Google, you have a lot of autonomy in what you click on and a lot of autonomy in what you decide to read. And so you kind of feel responsible regarding what you're reading and so on. But with the chatbot, it's a one-shot query. A chatbot provides a recommendation and doesn't give you a whole lot of other options. And because a chatbot is emulating a human-to-human type conversation, a user might legitimize the recommendation from a chatbot a lot more than what they would legitimize or attribute credibility to some advice that they get from Google or a blog somewhere. So there is that risk. Also, a chatbot, we don't want people to have a conversation with a chatbot at the expense of not having conversations with real people. So a chatbot shouldn't replace real human-to-human conversations. And so that is also a concern worth thinking about. One of the other challenges that I've been thinking about more recently, and I think it's quite interesting, is the challenge of actually auditing and validating a mental health chatbot. Because think about it, if a chatbot is sophisticated, there are millions of ways of having a dialogue with that chatbot. There are millions of permutations of those dialogues, and therefore you can't anticipate all of the unintended adverse effects that a dialogue might have. You can't look and assess all of the possible dialogues that a chatbot might provide. And there is a fantastic paper by Bickmore in 2018 in the Journal of Medical Internet Research. And he showcases a number of scenarios where smart speakers can actually deliver poor health advice, and the consequences of that advice can be quite significant. So ChatPal, this is the link to the ChatPal project. This is the link to the actual ChatPal app. Now the app itself is just a prototype. It's an early release. It wasn't due to be released until next June, but my colleague and myself and others decided that we should release a prototype because of COVID and get a minimum viable product out there in the wild. So the chatbot is pretty much delivers a linear conversation, and it coaches people around using content from the PERMA framework. PERMA is a positive psychology framework developed by Martin Seligman, and basically the content revolves around encouraging people to have more positive emotions in their life, encouraging engagement, that is getting into the flow state in their hobbies and work, encouraging more relationships and meaning and ambition in their life, as well as helping to track and manage general health and well-being. So you could say that we're taking a user-centered design approach for this because we are doing workshops with end users, but I kind of feel that we have went beyond the user. And I think it's important to go beyond the user. Now, we've heard the quotes from Henry Ford and others that if Henry Ford had have asked people what they wanted, they would say faster horses, right? But that's maybe one extreme. Users are very important, but I think we feel right now that a digital product doesn't live in a bubble with the user. A digital product lives in an ecosystem and can affect many other things like the environment and other stakeholders. So take, for example, my coffee machine in my kitchen. This is a photo that I took last night. Coffee machines are so convenient and user-centered that you can make a cup of coffee with one press of a button. As a result, I now drink a lot more coffee than I did before. And so I'm overdosed in coffee. And also there's a lot of wastage here as well. The capsules are not good for the environment. And you can actually ironically see a picture that that my wife did actually put up in our kitchen of all the other ways of making coffee. And those other ways are kind of like a labor of love. It can take quite some time to make coffee using those kind of French presses and so on. So you might think of many other examples like a dishwasher and a tumble dryer. They're so user-centered that we overuse them, and they're not indeed useful for other stakeholders or entities such as the environment. So I would say that we're taking more of a stakeholder-centered design approach. Of course, users are very important in that. And what we're doing, we're looking at these three entities. That is, we're looking at what people want or need. And we're looking at what mental health professionals would endorse. And we're looking at what AI can actually deliver well. And we're looking for that golden intersection between those three things. And you might go through a thought experiment here. And this really is a thought experiment. It's not real data. You might ask, well, what are the other intersections? Well, if you look at intersection 1, here you might get chatbots that are excellent at using scripted dialogues with quick replies and constrained free text answers. And if users wanted to self-diagnose, then probably the chatbot can provide a form of that by using those scripted dialogues with some, question answer style form filling, and collect symptoms and then suggest a diagnosis. And even if users want that, and even if AI can provide that, mental health professionals may not endorse that. And indeed, that's what we have found in our survey, is that mental health professionals are less likely to endorse a diagnostic chatbot. Intersection 2, again, this is just a thought experiment. Here, yes, AI chatbots can be very competent at assessing the user's needs using conversational form filling. And the chatbot can use this data to maybe signpost the user to paid services. Now, even if mental health professionals endorse that because they're delivering the paid services, and even if AI can deliver it very well, users may not want it because it feels unethical by design to use this freemium model to get people onboarded and then to all of a sudden ask them for payment to access a service that they really need. And of course, the third intersection, let's suppose users wanted a chatbot that could care for them, and that a chatbot that could actually detect when they're feeling down and then have conversations about that at the right moment, at the right time. Yes, perhaps this kind of chatbot could be endorsed by professionals, but if AI can't truly handle the context and detect the user's feelings at a reliable degree, then the chatbot might interrupt the user all the time, and there might be lots of false positives and alarm fatigue where you cry wolf all the time to the point where you miss the wolf. So with that kind of chatbot might result in all parties not being so happy because of the AI's incompetence. So it's important to look at what AI can do well in this Venn diagram. So we're concentrating on that golden intersection in the middle. This is the kind of architecture or methodology that we're using to design our chatbot. As I said, we have carried out a survey amongst mental health professionals. I think we have over 180 subjects so far, and we have carried out needs analysis workshops, around 50 subjects. I think we've got more than that now. And with that data, we can design the content or identify the content that's needed. And then what we did is that we actually had a multidisciplinary dialogue design workshop where we simply used Google Docs to allow mental health professionals, psychologists, technologists to all be in the Google Doc at the same time and design these chatbot scripts. Those dialogues were then converted into flow charts, and then they were integrated into an AI chatbot. So some of the kind of quotes from our needs analysis workshops are the following. You know, people thought that users might open up sooner because it's not a human, it's a computer, and they don't feel judged, perhaps. And people thought that the chatbot might be good for people who really need face-to-face support, but they're not quite up for it yet. And maybe a chatbot can be a first good stepping stone towards face-to-face services. In the needs analysis workshop, people wanted a chatbot personality that, you know, was female, extrovert, and maybe of an age around mid-30s, which was interesting. And this is what the users thought. What we also did, we looked at all of those user needs, and we had a multidisciplinary meeting where everybody was able to blindly and independently vote on what chatbot features they thought were most important and least important. And we were able to look at the average priority ratings. And then we also went through a ranking, which was quite interesting. And but from all of the needs, users felt that they wanted positivity. They wanted the chatbot to tell jokes, for example. They wanted the chatbot to focus on the positive sides of life and not have any negativity. And they wanted the chatbot to facilitate gratitude diaries and mood logs and all of those things, as well as psychoeducation, you know, raising the mental health literacy of people and coaching people is also important. Some of the results from our mental health survey with mental health professionals. Mental health professionals said that they're more likely to endorse chatbots that provide self-management, that provide psychoeducation and coaching and training, but they're less likely to support or endorse chatbots that are diagnostic or therapeutic. So The mental health professionals also thought chatbots might reduce travel time to services. They might help people manage their own mental health, and chatbots might prevent unnecessary visits to the mental health care providers. They also said that they also mentioned a few concerns, which are very important, I think. They mentioned that with chatbots, clients may not feel adequately connected to their healthcare professionals. They said that with chatbots, clients may not be able to verbalize their own mental health state clear enough so that the chatbot can understand it. And that is a real concern, because there is a limitation with natural language processing. And obviously humans are very good at understanding language. It is what we do. It is our bread and butter. And we obviously have empathy and all those other things. And the third concern from the top is relevant. They also say that with chatbots, clients may not accurately understand the diagnosis. So it seems to be that mental health professionals would not endorse chatbots that are diagnostic. So the big take-home message here in this presentation is really that we need robust design activities to responsibly design chatbots that support mental well-being. And this might include a stakeholder-centered design approach where we encourage systems thinking, because again, products don't live in a bubble with the user only. They live in an environment and an ecosystem. And we should try and find the sweet spot between what users want, what professionals will endorse, and what AI can do well. And of course, these are our future efforts next year. We are building new features for the chatbot. Interestingly, the chatbot will be multilingual. It will be in Swedish, Finnish, and Scots Gaelic. And we will be doing in the wild evaluations. That is evaluations outside of kind of standard trials, because you can never really measure the adoption of the technology or indeed the user retention as part of a standard trial, because in a standard trial, there are measures to encourage people to use it and so on. So we want to measure the true user retention of the chatbot by having an in the wild kind of study. So thank you, Shauna, and hopefully I didn't go too fast. I didn't time myself, so I wanted to speak fast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raymond. That was great. So we've had a few questions coming in, so I think we'll take a few questions now that kind of relate directly to the talk, and then hopefully there'll be some time as well at the end to kind of bring things together. So one of the questions that came up was about regulation, really, and how should mental health apps be certified and regulated. So I think that was in reference to the ORCA benchmark. I don't know if you have any thoughts specifically on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's something that I tried to mention in the talk, because chatbots can facilitate millions of different variations of dialogues, and you can't anticipate all the dialogues. Regulating them could be difficult. Now, I think we should take a staircase approach. I think chatbots should be limited in terms of their AI capability. I think facilitating open chit-chat kind of features will be very risky. And I think in our project, we'll be risk averse. In fact, in our project, we do a number of things. We tell the user that it is a chatbot and not a human from the start. And we repeatedly, we don't do this all the time, but the chatbot will often remind the user that it isn't intelligent, and that if they really do need help, they should contact the helpline, and there is a link to helplines in the chatbot. But in terms of regulation, I think the content, the scripted dialogues could be assessed for clinical assurance. I think you can take out all of the content, the scripted dialogues in the chatbot, and put them into an Excel sheet, for example, and you can have domain experts interrogate those kind of conversations. And of course, you could run software. For example, there are software packages that software engineers use, like Selenium, I think one is called, that allows you to automatically test software. And I think if we had automatic testing software for chatbots where you could pull out all a number of permutations of dialogues, I think that would also allow people to assess those dialogues. But there will be de facto scripts in a chatbot, and they could be assessed by domain experts in a very convenient tool like a spreadsheet.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that is really interesting because, yeah, a lot of the papers that have kind of explored the usability or looked at the kind of efficacy of existing chatbot tools, a lot of time the analysis will be, user reports, using kind of Likert scales and getting information like relating to that. But there seems to be relatively little work that uses the kind of the dialogue itself as a way to kind of explore what's happening. And as you say, getting those kind of different perspectives on that raw data could be very interesting.
Yeah, and also do obviously pull out the features, the key features in the chatbot. Like if there is a gratitude diary, for example, or a mood log, or some other coaching content, pull those out and go and look for the evidence. Go and look for the papers that show the efficacy of those tools that support mental well-being, and look for the paucity of evidence as well. Look for the lack of evidence and to support certain features. I think that is another way of regulating for the clinical assurance of chatbots.
Yeah, that's good. So there was another question that said, is there any empirical evidence that conversational interfaces are indeed more intuitive to people than other modalities, such as visual interfaces? Or I know there was one of your slides that talked about kind of multimodal inputs. So I guess, yeah, if you've got any thoughts on that, and whether there are results that kind of indicate that in different contexts, one modality might be better than another, or people with different affinities.
Yeah, I can't put any papers out of my mind right now, but I know if you're looking for that kind of evidence, there's a fantastic conference that you might be aware of called CHI, Computer Human Interaction. It's the leading research conference in the HCI, and I've been at that conference, and I know there are perhaps lots of chatbot research papers, some of which do compare the usability between a graphical user interface and a conversational user interface. And I think it's a topical area. And I know that I have read a paper on comparing the use of a chatbot to complete a survey, for example, versus an actual digital form. So which is more user friendly to people. And I just can't remember the result right now, but I have read that paper. And so it is an area that people are well aware of regarding comparing the usability of chatbots against graphical user interfaces. And again, there's a lot of variables in there because it does depend on what graphical user interface you're talking about, and it does depend on what chatbot you're talking about, and it does depend on what task the user is trying to do. I mean, there are certain tasks that would be completely unusable in a smart speaker. For example, if you wanted to compare and contrast the different kinds of flights you can have from London to San Francisco, you don't want the smart speaker verbalizing all of those options. So it does depend on a lot of things, but I'm pretty sure there are studies out there that look at that.
We've got another one here, which is talking about the use of, so it's from Eileen, one of the speakers from yesterday. And she said that research on the use of chatbot-based interventions shows promising results regarding usability and effectiveness, although there's not necessarily enough evidence up to now. But also for automated diagnostics, it may be a very good supplement to clinical diagnostics. Unfortunately, like you said, professionals do not accept this kind of technology yet. Do you have any ideas on how to increase the acceptance on the side of the professionals?
Well, I think I can only give a general statement to that that comes to mind. And I think there should be a widespread AI literacy amongst all healthcare professionals and many other domain experts. I think if we're going to use and trust these tools, then we have to have some understanding of how they work. And I know in certain healthcare domains that an AI algorithm can often just simply give you its recommendation without giving you any of the metadata or the reasoning behind that recommendation. And so I think if if domain experts know something about how they work and they're able to access information about how that algorithm was trained or developed, you know, they're able to see the data provenance and all of those things, then they're more likely to trust them, or at least trust them appropriately. Maybe they're more likely to under-trust them appropriately, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So I can only give a general answer to that question.
That's great. Then one more. You did talk about the fact that, yeah, obviously I think being transparent about the status of the agent is important. And you kind of, it was quite interesting that you said you sort of emphasize the fact that I am not, you know, your agent emphasized the fact that it is not intelligent. But once we start thinking about other ways in which we make dialogue feel naturalistic or you know, comfortable and familiar or flowing, it can bring into kind of focus some considerations about, you know, to what extent a chatbot should emulate human-like responses as closely as possible, or is it better for the chatbot to be very obviously an automated system? And once you get into kind of specifics of how that happens in the dialogue, that can start getting more difficult about, you know, what does an automated system response, how does it differ from a human generated, from how we as humans would talk? And have you done any thinking around that really, and where you draw the line in emulating human-like responses?
I guess just some comments on that. It is a very, I don't have an answer, but I think it's a very, because there is no answer. I think it's down to preference and whose ethics you want to talk about. Mm-hmm. I think generally we're very happy to be convinced of real emotion and empathy. For example, don't we watch series TV? Don't we watch movies? And the role of an actor is to convince you as a viewer that this is real, and you're happy to move into that world. I mean, we watch films and we're in the flow and in the zone as if it was a real event. Our emotions, our own emotions, are very real, even though perhaps some of the emotions from the actors are completely simulated. So we've been, and I guess that's entertainment, so it's a little bit different. But also, even stripping away the chatbot, the conversation, I know that there is research from many decades ago that shows that humans do treat computers as if they were social actors, and you might indeed have heard of the CASA theory, the computers as social actors theory. Yeah. That I think the early experiments were things like you know, a computer would do some tasks for a user, and that computer might ask the user, how well did I do? And the user would give an answer. But if a different computer asked the user, how well did computer A do? The user can give a different answer to the other computer. So it seems that subconsciously, perhaps, users are even polite to computers, even though they're not real conscious beings. So I think it is an open issue, and I think it's really interesting, and I think we could talk about that for a very long time, and I don't think there will be a conclusion. I think it's like ethics more generally. I think it is an open conversation. When do you stop a smart speaker being too humanized or too human-like? Mm-hmm. And of course, I know that in the state of California, if I believe in the state of California, chatbots have to disclose that they are a chatbot to avoid any deception. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I can only give comments on that kind of query.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really useful. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll move on to our second speaker now. Thank you very much, Raymond. And then we'll have some there might be some more discussion at the end. So our next speaker today is Rose McCabe. Rose is a professor of clinical communication at City University of London. Her research focuses on the microanalysis or microanalyzing video recorded consultations to understand and improve healthcare practitioner-patient communications and therapeutic relationships in mental health care. Her work has focused, for example, on communicating a diagnosis or breaking bad news, shared decision-making, and question design in the assessment of suicidality. And she has studied how different practitioners interact with people with psychosis, depression, and dementia across a range of different treatment settings. She's studied how she also uses mixed methods to link processes to outcomes in healthcare contexts, and she translates conversation analytic findings into novel interventions to improve communication and patient outcomes. So she's previously collaborated with computational linguists and done work that is more on that side, but today she will be talking to us about the interactions that occur between clinicians and patients, and specifically talk around suicide in those contexts. So I'll hand over to Rose.
Thanks, Shauna. So let me just get my screen set up. Can you see my screen now?
I can, that's perfect, yeah.
Okay, great. Good, are we centered and everything, and everybody can hear me okay? Great, thank you so much. And thank you for your really interesting talk, Raymond. As Shauna said, I'm going to talk about a study that we did looking at how healthcare professionals ask patients about self-harm and suicidality. And I guess I've changed my title slightly to think about this idea of intersubjectivity and suicide, and how communication in the clinic compares also to self-reports of suicidality. I think that's an interesting angle following on from your talk, Raymond, about whether people might open up more with chatbots, for example, than in face-to-face interaction. I think a big issue here is trust, in terms of whether people feel they trust the agent, whether that's a virtual agent or a real person. Just to say that obviously this work was done with my co-authors here, Imran Hassan, who was a PhD student, Barnes, Richard Bing, who's a GP, and Stefan Priebe, who's a psychiatrist. So just to situate the work more generally, as Shauna mentioned, I work on communication, therapeutic relationships, interventions, methodological innovations, and also linking communication, therapeutic relationships to outcomes. So I use a range of methods, from detailed kind of microanalysis to look at conversation, to conducting randomized controlled trials in health services research. Interestingly, I mean, you were talking a little bit about empathy, Raymond. I think the thing that we kind of repeatedly hear from people with mental health issues and people who use services is that the kind of therapeutic relationship is perhaps the most important aspect of care for them. And it certainly mitigates kind of how well they engage in and benefit from treatment. So the degree to which an agent might simulate kind of human-like behavior is an interesting one, and how they might communicate caring, for example, is really, really interesting. Just to mention some other studies before we move on. So, so Shauna's already mentioned, we've worked on kind of shared decision-making and communicating a diagnosis of dementia in the shared project on the bottom left. We're conducting a 5-year program grant on supporting people with suicide and self-harm who come into A&E in crisis. That's a 5-year study where we'll end up in a trial. We've worked with GPs around how people disclose and communicate mental health problems and how GPs support them, and also develop training for people with psychosis. So it's just some examples. Also, just to mention that a key area in mental health communication is embodied communication and the importance of nonverbal communication. And that's a key issue in, I guess, communicating distress. We've done some work on 3D motion capture, looking here more at its diagnostic relevance in psychosis. So whether there's kind of reduced nonverbal reciprocity in psychosis, and whether this impacts on interpersonal rapport. But it is a key issue across, I think, all aspects of communication in mental health care, from diagnosis to treatment. As Shauna mentioned, the content in this talk particularly will engage with emotionally distressing issues and present distressing video clips of communication about suicidality and self-harm. These are real cases, and obviously, you know, if you or you've been affected by them personally in your family or in your friendship group, they are really difficult clips. I am sorry about this, but that they are so difficult. Please tune out for the videos if you feel that's best. But I feel it's important nonetheless to present this material. We know that every 40 seconds in the world someone dies by suicide, so it's a very significant problem internationally. We don't have any tests for, you know, whether somebody is at risk of suicide, so we don't have any scans or any physical biomarkers, we don't have any blood tests, we don't have anything like that. So all kind of all assessment of suicidality and risk for suicide is assessed through communication. In terms of contact with healthcare professionals before death, those people who die by suicide, 1 in 4 of these will have contact with specialists in the year before their death. 1 in 2 will have contact with a primary care practitioner in the month before their death. Besides the kind of potential of picking up these people at risk, I personally have an interest in also how these assessments or contacts have potential to be therapeutic. And we hear this repeatedly from people with lived experience of suicidality and self-harm, that actually talking to the person is a key part of the therapeutic process. So what I'm going to be talking about today is assessing for suicide risk. Conducted in most of these were face-to-face conversations, and where healthcare practitioners ask patients about feelings or thoughts of ending their life or of harming themselves, and then also perhaps past events associated with self-harm or making an attempt on their life. So the research questions we had were, what types of questions do healthcare professionals ask about these phenomena? I mean, how do they do this? And do the questions influence how the patients respond to these questions? So our data was 319 audio or video, mostly video recorded outpatient visits for depression or schizophrenia across primary care and secondary care. We ended up with 89 cases, if you like, of risk assessment. These were conducted by 40 different professionals, and they were psychiatrists, GPs, community psychiatric nurses, and they were conducted with 84 patients. So some of the patients were asked more than one question, if you like. And we analysed the data using conversation analysis, which is a microanalytic method which looks at the detail of conversation, and I'll show you a little bit about that shortly. And it analyzes data based on video recordings usually, and obviously incorporate verbal and non-verbal communication. So what we found were that all 89 questions were closed questions. So closed questions are questions that can be answered with a single word, either yes or no, or a short phrase. So for example, do you ever feel like ending your life, is the closed question, which is answerable with a yes or a no. Closed questions are used to restrict the type of information that is received. They also limit the contributions that patients are able to make. They're used to gather factual information and quick responses which keep control of the conversation. And that's often important for practitioners because they have an agenda that they need to get through in the particular context that they're working. So for example, in primary care, this will be, 7 minutes to get through a range of issues with somebody. And one of these tasks will be to do a risk assessment. So I'm going to show you some examples of the data, and what we found was that these closed questions, there's no such thing as a neutral closed question. So often we'll hear in kind of healthcare communication, literature and training that, ask patients neutral questions, but actually all closed questions either lean towards inviting a yes or a no answer. So let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. And I hope you can hear this clip okay. It is actually quite low, but hopefully you'll be able to see the transcript as the video plays. Okay, so this particular example is from a psychiatric outpatient consultation. And you can see that the question that the psychiatrist asks is, sometimes feel like life is not worth living anymore. So this question invites a yes or a no response. So it's technically a yes-no interrogative. It invites agreement or disagreement to a candidate answer. So all questions pose hypotheses, and the hypothesis in this question is the patient sometimes feels like life is not living. So the thing about these questions is they can communicate an expectation of a particular response then also through their polarity. So this is work from linguistics looking at kind of positive and negative polarity items in talk. So a positive polarity item is sometimes, do you sometimes feel life is not worth living anymore? Whereas a negative polarity item, which is used in questions inviting a no, are ever, any, and at all. And we see these items ever, any, at all in a lot of these questions. So let's move on a little bit more. So let's look back at the example now. Okay, so if we have a look at the transcript now, so this is a conversation analytic transcript, so don't get too distressed by this about the notation, but really what we transcribe here are things like pitch, intonation, stress, overlap, pauses, how quiet or loud the talk is. So we'll go through this little clip here. So we get the doctor asking a preliminary question, do you get low in mood occasionally? There's a very brief delay, 0.2 seconds, which is not a sign of anything unusual in talk. And the patient says, yeah, and nods. So she agrees to this question. The patient getting the doctor getting the go ahead from this preliminary question then proceeds to ask, sometimes feel like life is not worth living anymore. So we get this yes inviting question, and to which the patient immediately responds with a nod and a yeah. A little delay from the doctor, and the doctor asks a confirmatory question, do you get that? So we get the patient agreeing with the question type. So the question's asking for a yes or a no. It's actually an inviting a yes. It's a yes-no question, which is inviting a yes. And the patient conforms with this question type and with her response, which is yes, and it's done quickly. And we know that agreement in talk happens quickly, whereas lack of agreement happens with delay and hedging devices. And we'll see an example of that. So let's listen to this clip, which is a no inviting question. So we get the doctor here asking, do you ever think that life isn't worth living? Which is a yes-no question and is inviting a no because of the use of the negative polarity item ever. With long delay, so anything approaching normally turn exchange in conversation happens quickly with minimal delay and minimal overlap. Only about 5% of talk happens in overlap. And in conversation, anything approaching like over half a second towards a second in between turns signifies some difficulty in speaker responding. So we get a 1.4 second pause here, and then the patient says no. Okay, so we get this no inviting question, and obviously when you can hear the audio, you get a bit more sense of how the questions are asked, which adds extra meaning to, I guess, how those questions might be interpreted. So let's have a look at another example. And so I guess the thing to say about this example is that patient again conforms with the question design, which is asking for a yes or a no. And here it's inviting, expecting a no, and the patient gives a no. Now, the patients can also not conform with this question design, and they can give a narrative response. So let's have a listen to this. This is a particularly distressing example, which is a woman who's been referred from primary care to see a psychiatrist with depression. She's had a very, very, very difficult kind of life in general. Her son was found in his own flat after taking a heroin overdose. The woman has also had a number of other kind of difficult life circumstances. So we get the GP asking the patient that she feel that she can't go on anymore. So this is a difficult clip. So really, if you'd like to leave temporarily, this would be a good point to do so. Okay, so I mean, the thing to say as well is that, as you can see, but with the transcription, talk is really very messy, and this is the way it actually happens, although it's not the way that we hear it. So just to have a look at this, the first line on this transcript, I played you the beginning of it just to kind of the context, just to the run into the question. So we get the doctor asking, do you ever feel yourself that you can't go on anymore? So we get another yes, no question with a negative polarity item ever, which is no, expecting a no. Do you ever feel yourself that life isn't worth living? Now, we get the patient then coming in not with a yes, no, but with a narrative response. So she says, at the moment, I would like it all to stop sometimes because it's just, and obviously you can hear that she's crying through this excerpt, which we haven't transcribed here. And the doctor says, you'd like what? So a request to elaborate. Could you say what you'd like? And then in overlap in line 12, patient says, all this, I'd like it all to stop sometimes. The doctor gives a continuer in line 14. And then the doctor asks in line 16, do you mean by turning your mind off, or do you mean by sort of actually, we get a lot of overlapping talk here. So this is the square brackets, and overlapping talk is usually signaling that people are kind of misaligned about the kind of activity that's going on. And we get a bit more overlap in this transcript here. But we get the patient resisting the terms of the question. So she's pushing back against the design of the question, what it's looking for, and to describe the difficulties that she sees them in her own terms. So we see then in this consultation that there is a pursuit of a yes and no response. So the patient account continues and the doctor returns to the suicide question. Okay, so those budding conversation among you will hear that we'll pick up that you can see that the doctor is really pursuing this yes-no question. So we get this obviously distressing kind of account for the patient about what's happened with her son. And then we get the doctor returning to, okay, I need to ask you, so invoking the kind of institutional need to ask, have you ever thought yourself that you don't want to live anymore? Have you ever actually had suicidal thoughts since her son? So the patient responds then in line 4, I don't really know, subconsciously I might have done, I don't really know. So we get another no inviting question with this, have you ever yourself thought that you don't want to live anymore? We get this not a yes, no response from the patient in line 4 or 5. The doctor follows up with another question, another yes, no question. So you've never actually done something. So we get a stronger form of a no inviting question, which is a negative declarative question. So you've never actually done something, or you're not thinking of taking your life, is a negative declarative question. Patient says no, no. Doctor says consciously or objectively. Patient says no, no, no. And the patient says no again, line 12. Only when we get this no response, which is what the doctor was looking for, either a yes or a no, do we get an acceptance by the doctor with okay in line 13, and the evidence then that she's ready to move on to the next topic, because she says, have you ever had any other symptoms you described to me, like your mind is playing tricks on you? So the evidence here is in the next kind of in conversation analysis is about the next turn, about what's happening. Here we can see the doctor's ready to move on once she gets her no response. So in terms of thinking about how this corresponds to after this assessment. So it's the issue as suicide or evidence of suicidality. Can you hear me okay, Shauna?
Yeah, I had a little pause. I'm not sure if other people had, kind of since we moved on to this slide, I had some disruption, but I'm not sure. Anyone in the chat, let me know if you just...
Yeah.
5 problems.
Yeah, okay. I think from the beginning of this slide, maybe.
Yeah, it's maybe worth turning off your video, Rose.
This one.
Yeah, you seem to be dropping a little bit.
Is this okay, Shauna?
Yeah. So yeah.
Yes, sorry.
That's fine. That's great.
Okay, so this is a patient who directly after this appointment reported that she had thoughts of killing herself on the PHQ questionnaire. So we did look at whether doctors were more likely, for example, to ask patients. There was an issue of, are doctors intuitively picking up that some patients, you know, are less suicidal? So it's something about what they're sensing. Are they asking them, patients who they sense are not suicidal, are they asking them inviting questions versus asking the patients who they may intuitively feel are more at risk, are they asking them more yes inviting questions? but there was no evidence that this was the case when we looked at the comparison of the way they asked the question and what patients reported after the assessment. So let's have a look at another example here, which is a no inviting setup here. And this is again another outpatient psychiatric appointment. Okay, so what we find from this clip is that actually it turns out that the patient has taken an overdose. So, and this comes out because the doctor says, it says here on the record that such and such a nurse says that you took X number of paracetamol. The evidence here is that the way in which the question is designed is kind of strongly leading the patients to say no when the question invites a no. So let's listen to this answer again, because she says, I have thought about it, but. So let's listen again. Okay, so we get another no inviting question with, have you ever made any attempts on your life? So what we found across the whole 89 data cases that we had was that doctors were 3 times more likely to use a no inviting question. So three out of the 4 questions were no inviting to patients across settings. And what happened when did this impact on the way in which the patients responded? So what we found was when the question invited a no with these negative polarity question items, or saying, so you never felt like you've never done anything to harm yourself, so these negative declarative questions, the patient responded no 85% of the time and yes 15% of the time. And when the question invited a yes, which is less frequently, the patients responded yes roughly half the time and no roughly half the time. And so there's a significant kind of difference in terms of the way in which the patients answered the question depending on how the question was asked. So we did look at, was it that, some doctors always used, did they differ their range of questions? But we found that over half of the doctors always used the inviting questions. So we're just looking at, what was it about, what kind of factors might influence the way in which they're using these questions, but some of them always use this framing. So in terms of reflections from the video, and also as part of these studies, we did interviews with patients and the practitioners, and we've done a lot more since. There is a kind of a fundamental issue about what does it mean to feel suicidal? What counts? Particularly if you're asked a yes/no question, and you're not a very, high-end yes, or not a definite no, but you're somewhere in the middle of this area, which most people are. How do you answer this question? From the practitioner's point of view, there is an institutional pressure to elicit a yes/no. So there is, in a way, it's kind of like a tick box exercise, because they need to put an answer on the record, because if something happens to somebody, then they will be hauled into the coroner's court and have to account for what they did. Did they assess the risk thoroughly? Did they get a clear, yes or a no? And did they then follow up on that, on the patient's state of mind? So there is, to a certain degree, a bit of defensive practice going on here, and doctors recognize that they are doing this. Also, something that you mentioned, Raymond, that obviously patients can be reluctant to disclose because of negative consequences. There's obviously self-stigma. There's stigma when you're talking to other people, but there's also the consequences of telling a healthcare professional that you're feeling suicidal, that you may be admitted to hospital, that you may have children removed, from your care. So there's all of these additional consequences, and particularly for women, obviously, having children removed from their care is a very, very significant factor. And we found this also in perinatal mental health care as well. These questions certainly make it more difficult for patients to disclose suicidal thoughts, and patients are aware of this. They know it. They know that you're not supposed to answer yes to this question, and there is a big role in terms for trust and the degree to which people will disclose this kind of highly sensitive, stigmatized information to practitioners. So in terms of the factors at play, there's some interesting work from conversation analysis around medical question design in general, if that's what other people are working on, but it's a work done by John Heritage, who's looked at the kind of what he calls the principle of optimization in medical question design. And this is the idea that really, and in talk in general, we talk in a way that kind of foregrounds positive aspects and kind of minimizes negative aspects. And in medical communication, this is around when doctors ask questions, they frame them in such a way as it's the best health outcome for the patient. So if you go to your GP, it'll be something like no heart disease, no asthma, no allergies, that kind of thing. So that's the principle of optimization at work. So if you think about in relation to suicide, well, obviously the best outcome for the patient is that they're not feeling suicidal. Another factor at play here is that there's obviously information on the record. So it's one thing kind of saying something, communicating how you feel, but it's another thing that it goes on an official record and the implications of that. For practitioners, there are workload implications in terms of the need for a more in-depth assessment, referrals, admissions. So if they do identify that a person is at risk, all of these things need to be kicked in to action. And they may also feel that they can be reluctant sometimes to escalate these, what they feel are often maybe a bureaucratic risk assessment procedures, and they feel that they may not be in the patient's best interest. So there is a lot of kind of discussion around positive risk management, which doesn't necessarily, it doesn't mean that, okay, if you say you're suicidal, you automatically, we have to escalate up the kind of the next steps in terms of, taking you out of your own environment or these kinds of activities. So it's about managing risk positively and keeping patients in their own kind of in their ongoing life situation. This is some interesting work that's done by a Swiss group, Raymond et al. And it's an oldish study now, but it's an interesting one which found that to video recordings of psychiatrist nonverbal communication in accident and emergency departments after people had presented following a suicide attempt. And they wanted to look at how successful the psychiatrists were in predicting people who would reattempt suicide over the following 24 months. And they asked the psychiatrists to make written predictions, but they also analysed the psychiatrist's nonverbal behaviour and the patient's nonverbal behaviour in these video consultations. And what they found was that the written predictions were correct 22% of the time. So the psychiatrists got it right, that the patients would reattempt suicide in just about a fifth of the cases. However, when they looked at nonverbal communication of the psychiatrist, they found that the nonverbal communication of the psychiatrist correctly predicted those patients who would reattempt suicide 91% of the time. So what they found in particular was that if you like, the embodied communication of the psychiatrist, so in particular, their kind of gaze and frowning at the patient was associated with those patients who would reattempt suicide. So there seems to be something maybe that the psychiatrists are kind of sensing in embodied behavior, but it's not translating into the written predictions for various reasons. So in terms of how this links to kind of wider findings, the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Homicide has consistently found that most people who took their life were classified as low or no risk in their final contact with mental health services. This is not just a problem in the UK. So a number of studies have found that internationally that, for example, this Finnish study found that of 100 suicide victims seen on the day they died, suicidal ideation was discussed in only 21 of those appointments, so only a fifth of those appointments. So there's a strong preference to kind of, for this really difficult talk, not to be kind of raised to the surface of the conversation. And we often see on kind of post-mortem reports that, and coroners' reports that prior to death, patients don't communicate suicidal ideation or deny suicidal ideation. That's a common thing that we'll see in reports. And another study in the US by Smith et al. Found that 85% of people who died by suicide, again, denied suicidal ideation, even 0 to 7 days prior to death. So it's, there seems to be something in the way that these questions are asked that may be linked to this, if you like, not reporting or denial. So these findings we've published in this paper, if anybody's interested in finding out a little bit more. These are just some references for people if you're interested in looking up some of the details for more. And obviously just to thank our funders, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Rose. That was great. And I can see that we've got a few questions coming in already. So there's one that kind of came up that I think was touched on as well yesterday, so I think it's probably just worth looking at. Do you think it's reason that, I think we had talks yesterday and where we're talking about self-harm and we're talking about suicide, and these are obviously distinct, and yet there can be a tendency to talk about them and cluster them together. And do you think it's reasonable or justifiable to do that, or what, you know, from your experience, how do you kind of frame that thinking around those?
Yeah, well, I think so. We follow the NICE guidance on the definition of self-harm, which includes kind of what might traditionally have what traditionally has been discussed as kind of deliberate self-harm without intent to die, if you like, and any kind of other act of self-harm with intent to end your life. So the NICE guidance has clear definition of self-harm, which includes any act of self-harm irrespective of the motive or intent, because we also know that people who do self-harm, and again taking away the kind of idea of motive or intent, are, you know, significantly, they're kind of 40 times more likely to die by suicide. So the kind of distinction in a way is becoming a little bit more kind of outdated, if you like. So although there is a distinction in terms of some people, you know, do use self-harm as a kind of as a means of coping with really difficult kind of experiences. So I mean, we are mindful of that it does play a different role for different people. But yeah, that kind of the NICE guidance on self-harm, that definition is the one that kind of is used most often now in the clinical domain.
Great, thanks. So obviously the work that you presented here works a lot from video content. Are there similarly detailed studies about therapist-patient questions and responses in text-based interactions you can think of? Or
no, so obviously Valentin, who's going to present this afternoon from ISO, will talk about text-based dialogue, and to my knowledge, I'm not sure whether they have looked specifically at questions around suicide and self-harm and assessing risk in that context, because the assessing risk doesn't happen so much in psychotherapeutic interaction, if that makes sense. It happens more in kind of the interactions with GPs, psychiatrists, nurses. Happens sometimes, you know, it does happen a bit in psychotherapeutic interaction, but not as often. And I'm not aware of studies that have looked at it using text-based dialogue.
Well, there was a question earlier relating to, sorry, one of your slides, I probably should have started with this one, but I didn't scroll back far enough quickly enough. Was there, I think it was when we responses to the yes/no interrogatives, and I think they were asking whether there was a ground truth known, whether they related to whether it could be determined whether they were true or false negatives. So when the patient said no but had taken an overdose afterwards. So obviously you knew that in one case. I am imagining there are a lot of examples where you don't know. I mean, it still seems statistically significant or just plainly clear when you have sort of 90% leading with the no questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So I think what the bottom line is that it depends on how the information is elicited. So, and there is I think that's the difficulty here. There's no ground truth, because, you know, the patient might report one thing on self-report. They might say something else in a face-to-face assessment. And really we need, I mean, you know, we need much more kind of work on how these things kind of are associated with each other, in terms of looking at more kind of substantive and more evidence around. This was an observational study, which also is problematic. And it would be difficult to design an experimental study on this, but not that we haven't thought about doing something like that, but we do need to kind of somehow experimentally manipulate the way in which we elicit the information so that we get some idea about what this might be, what the crash might be.
Yeah. And are these sorts of findings being then integrated into the training of clinicians as well?
Yeah. So I mean, I think one of the things that's really difficult is that so in our study in A&E at the moment is that such a strong kind of fear, if you like, about practitioners being hauled over the coals if a patient says yes and uncovers a lot of risk, and then it's defensive, but it's less. You're making yourself less vulnerable if you're eliciting kind of a no for the record, if that makes sense. So we are working on it, but it's by no means easy. It's not as much to do with the actual, I mean, the question design stuff is important, and understanding the differences, and some practitioners are changing their practice as a result of that, but there's an important organizational backdrop to that. And it's about kind of, we've had lots of discussions around, we have to work with kind of, chief execs from NHS trusts around supporting staff to change their practice because they're too worried about the implications.
Yeah.
Because they're opening themselves up, yeah.
I've seen similar things when looking at incident reporting in NHS data.
Yes.
But there is a wider cultural context of how, authority and attributed.
Yeah.
Okay, got another one here. What are the implications? Are the data strong enough to suggest clinicians should be encouraged to always use positive? Oh, we've kind of covered that a bit, but is the evidence kind of strong enough that clinicians should be encouraged to always use positive polarity words in their questioning, or would this result in some false positives and cause difficulties for patients in the ways you highlighted towards the end of the talk, or perhaps a move towards open-ended and then first and then moving to a closed afterwards as a confirmation step maybe?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, a really good question. I think one of the things that we've talked a lot to, I mean, we did this work, quite a while ago, and we've been talking to practitioners and patients and user groups ever since about this work. And I think, so one of the things that I think is more helpful to start off with an open question. So something like, how do you feel about the future? Mm-hmm. So it's at least you get kind of, you starting more with the patient's experiences, and then you can start going down narrower in the questioning. I think there is certainly, given that there's such self-stigma, there's such stigma, we know that, patients always say it's so difficult to kind of even admit to yourself, never mind to a doctor, that you feel this way, that there is a strong rationale for supporting more of these positive questions, because that risk is less problematic for people, that if a patient can still say no to that, and it looked like, those questions were eliciting kind of equal yes and no responses, whereas the no questions were eliciting, many more no responses. Which didn't have an association with what patients were reporting in their self-report. So that seems to be, I think, given the difficulty in social interaction about bringing this stigmatized, so really difficult material to the surface, I think the positive question design it would be preferable.
Yeah. There was a kind of a broader discussion going on in the chat about empathy, and I think kind of, does the perceived empathy of the therapist or doctor, is that taken into account when the patient's response? And that seems to kind of relate to what you were saying about the embodied work, where in an embodied way the psychiatrists were demonstrating some achievement, perhaps, although weren't necessarily able to articulate that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously the videos are really blurred out, but if you, in the first one where we get this, do you sometimes feel life is not worth living anymore? The psychiatrist kind of sitting forward, his tone of voice is lower. He's looking at the patient, he's not looking at his notes. Whereas in, for example, the last clip where we get, turns out the patient has actually taken an overdose. The psychiatrist is kind of looking at his notes, not looking at the patient. And it's clearly kind of hugely important, but also kind of if a patient, you know, is clearly really distressed in that difficult audio clip, is how does the, you know, that patient did not rate that interaction as, and that relationship very strongly afterwards. So we always take measures of the relationship as well after the consultation. So she didn't rate it, because if you can't share how you're actually feeling, then, you know, that's, and I guess the lack of empathy there might be to do with the institutional agenda as opposed to the actual, you know, that trumps the empathy agenda, if you like, in the risk assessment context.
And it might be a good moment actually to bring Raymond back in as well, actually, if you're still.
Sorry, Shauna, what was that about empathy?
It's a good moment to bring you back in as well. I was just thinking in terms of, with your experience with the project, I mean, how did, you know, it's a very different context. There's a very different notion, as you kind of highlighted, empathy. There can be a performance towards to give you an emulation of empathy when you're dealing with a chatbot, and it can try and manifest that, but there's, you know, there is no concept of it being a truly a genuine empathetic.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say there is that what just came to mind, of course, is that a lot of people can pretend to be empathetic. So we have the same problem with people as what we would, obviously with a chatbot, we know for sure that it actually doesn't feel emotions. I mean, for example, my browser, even outside of chatbots, my browser, if it crashes, it will tell me, oops, how embarrassing. I'm very sorry about that. No, I don't think my computer is embarrassed at all. Like, I don't think my browser is actually embarrassed. But anyway, I mean, I think it is a very interesting issue, and that goes right back to science fiction and HAL, for example. You know, the psychopathic computer. So there's lots of discussion that can be had around that. Although somebody might say, well, it's not really the chatbot that's having the empathy. It is the designers and the psychologists and psychiatrists and the team behind the chatbot who designed those conversations. So I don't really know what the right answer is, but there are certainly open issues to be discussed.
So there's a question about what measures do you Rose use to
evaluate? Yeah, I'm just trying to chat in the box there. So we use the scales. So in the context that we work on are a little bit different to the kind of scales we've done a lot of work on the therapeutic relationship in mental health care, which is a bit different from psychotherapy. And we have reviewed all that literature as well, and including the scales. So we use something called the Helping Alliance scale, and also the scale to assess the therapeutic relationship, the STAR, which was developed by one of my PhD students, Rebecca Maguire-Sneakus, because some of the kind of activities and aspects are a little bit different in mental health care than in psychotherapy.
And we've got one more that relates to the doctor-patient examples. You know, different linguistic constructions can require different amounts of cognitive processing. So negation scope, so can be process. Can they sometimes explain the nature of the response, e.g. delays, regardless of the suicide-related context? You know.
It's not something, I have to be honest, it's not something that I've looked at. But the kind of systematicity of our findings wouldn't suggest. And actually, if you get, I mean, that those no inviting questions are usually shorter, but they're followed by longer delays. And we know that the delay, I mean, there's really important work on agreement and disagreement by Anita Pomerantz. If people are interested, I would advise you to have a look at that. But it's a kind of the building blocks for so much of our communication of kind of delay is a real signal of disagreement in conversation, rather than, let's say, I mean, they wouldn't look at it in terms of cognitive load, but that's the way we would look at it. And those questions, as I said, tend to be more perfunctory. So I guess from a kind of an immediate kind of point of feedback to your question is, it wouldn't suggest to me that cognitive load is an issue there.
Okay, I think it's probably time to wrap up, as it's 12:30. Well, thank you. Thank everyone for joining us, but a thank you especially to our two speakers. That was really, really interesting, and definitely left us with lots to think about. So yes, thank the speakers.